Chapter 451. Maisie was stunned. She lowered her head and replied, I guess so. How about the kids? Stephen asked slowly, they're going to be very sad if you two get a divorce, right? Maisie pressed her lips thin and replied, he told me that after we get a divorce, we'll take care of the kids together. So that means I can still stay with them. Shocked, Stephen said, that's what Mr. Goldman told you? Honestly, he did not expect Nolan to say something like that. Maisie nodded. Considering Nolan's identity, if he really wanted to have nothing to do with her, he could take custody of the children away from her. He could even make it impossible for her to get anything. However, he did not do any of that. Therefore, she deeply believed that there were other reasons he wanted to get a divorce from her. It was just that he refused to tell her. Kennedy called her. She walked to the side and picked up the phone. Yes, Uncle Kennedy? Okay. I'll be right there. Kennedy is looking for you? Stephen asked. Maisie hung up the call and turned her head around to look at him. Yeah. Dad, can you help me to take care of the kids? I need to go to the office for a while. Stephen smiled. All right. Drive safe. Maisie came to Soul Jewelry by car. As soon as she stepped into the hall, she saw Kennedy was saying something to the shooting crew. Maisie had learned from Kennedy's call that Soul had invited Irene, the rising actress, to be its spokesperson. They had a shooting today. But the shooting crew and staff had been waiting for her for a whole morning, yet she had not shown up. After calling her several times, Irene's assistant even threatened them, saying that they would not shoot anymore if they kept pushing them, as Irene was currently shooting a variety show. Soul could wait, but the shooting crew could not. Kennedy walked up to her. The shooting crew cannot wait any longer. Ms. Linwood has signed the contract, and her action has seriously affected the shooting process. Maisie looked at him and asked, did you manage to get in touch with Ms. Linwood herself? Kennedy shook his head. In the meantime, a staff member mumbled, this Irene is just acting like an ass. She could have told us and not signed the contract if she didn't want to cooperate with us. She had signed the contract but refused to show up during the shooting and made everyone wait for her. All of the costumes and jewelry were made ready, and the shooting crew was all prepared. They were just waiting for her, not to mention that rehearsal would take a lot of time. Maisie kept her hand on her chin and sank into thought. After a short while, she said, let's find someone else. Find someone else? The staff was shocked. After all, wouldn't it be too rushed to find someone else right now? Besides, Soul was a newly established jewelry company. The cost of inviting an A-list celebrity to be their spokesperson was high. For example, it had taken about $1 million to invite Irene to be their spokesperson this time. If they changed the spokesperson now, who would come and help them? Maisie looked at them and said faintly, since they didn't take us seriously and went back on their promise first, I don't see any problem for us to change the spokesperson. Besides, we can't just wait for her like this. But who would come and help us? Kennedy frowned. After all, it was nearly impossible to get someone to help them in just a few hours. Maisie suddenly thought of someone. She lifted her brows and smiled. We just need someone who's popular and can reach out to many people, right? Kennedy was stumped. Are you talking about, I have a candidate in my mind, Maisie said as she took her phone out and looked through her contact list. A person from the shooting crew came over and asked, who else can reach out to many people other than someone from the entertainment industry? Maisie put her phone to her ear and replied faintly. How about Louis, the young heir of the Lucas family? Chapter 452. Louis was the famous violin prince, so he definitely could reach out to a lot of people. Not only that, but he was also an alumnus of the Royal Academy of Music. Kennedy was stunned. He thought Maisie would look for Helios. But he did not expect that she was actually talking about Louis. Although it was not a bad idea to ask Lewis to become the spokesperson of Soul Jewelry, and Kennedy was certain that Lewis would get the job done beautifully. Would Lewis agree since he had never become the spokesperson for any brand before? Maisie walked to the side to talk. Kennedy did not know what she had said to Lewis, but she suddenly turned her head around and made an okay sign at him. Kennedy hurriedly gave the order to the people around him, "Go make the preparation." 10 minutes later, Lewis arrived at Soul Jewelry. A lot of them were seeing Lewis for the first time, and they were taken aback by his look. He was standing at 6.3 feet tall. And the length of his legs was about 3.7 feet. He had a very good-looking face, and there was a hint of defiance edging on his eyebrows. His monolid gave people the impression that he was cold, yet at the same time, he looked just like a prince walking out of a fairy tale. Everyone had a hard time peeling their gazes away from him once they set their eyes on him. Maisie took a look at her watch and smiled at him. "Right on time. Why did you suddenly want to see me?" Lewis asked, curiously. After all, Maisie had never taken the initiative to look for him. So he was kind of surprised. "I have a favor to ask." "And what favor is that?" Retaining the smile on her face, Maisie said, "To help save the day." She couldn't afford Helios, so she could only turn her target to Lewis. It was only now that Lewis realized what Maisie meant by "save the day." "You want me to become the spokesperson for Soul Jewelry?" Lewis frowned. "But I've never become the spokesperson for any brand before." "Well, there's a first time for everything." Maisie grinned. "I'll pay you accordingly, so don't worry about that. Besides, you're my family, so you won't sit by and watch me die, right?" Maisie turned around without waiting for Lewis to respond and ordered her crew with a smile, "Take Mr. Lucas to try on the costume and put on makeup. We're going to start the shooting soon." She had made the decision for him. The commercial endorsement featuring Irene had changed. After Maisie had discussed it with the shooting crew, she then personally designed the costume for Lewis. On the other side, Irene came out of the swimming pool. She was wearing a bikini, and her voluptuous figure had a sharp contrast with her innocent looks. She fit the current popular standards for female celebrities: fair, skinny, and young. Her pure and sweet look and her voluptuous body were what made her so popular. Her assistant draped a towel on Irene's shoulders. She walked up to a folding chair and took her seat. As she sipped on the glass of juice, she asked, "Soul hasn't called yet?" Her assistant took a look at the phone and said, "Nope. I guess they were too embarrassed to urge us anymore. They're just a new company, and they have a lot of nerves to urge us. Anyway, I'm tired. Call them and tell them that I'll go for the shooting this afternoon." After all, they would forgive her. Anyway, her uncle was a famous director. And because of that, everyone had been exceptionally lenient toward her. The assistant made the call, and her expression changed after she heard what they said. "What do you mean by you've decided to change the spokesperson?" Irene put the juice down and looked at her assistant. Her assistant growled angrily. "Who do you think we are? Some kind of monkey? We've signed the contract, so how could you change the spokesperson?" Kennedy took a few breaths to calm himself down and said, "Please understand that you're the one who failed to fulfill your contract. We need to catch up with the shooting process, and since Ms. Lindwood is busy, we figured that we shouldn't disturb you anymore. Thus, we decided to change the spokesperson. Is there anything wrong with that?" Chapter 453. What kind of attitude is that? Attitude? You're talking attitude with me now? Kennedy harumphed. We just let you have a taste of your own medicine. Besides, it doesn't necessarily need to be Ms. Linwood either. After that, Kennedy hung up the call. The assistant walked up to Irene and said, "Irene, Soul has decided to change the spokesperson." Irene had never been treated like this before, and her face sank when she heard what her assistant said. "They're just an unknown jewelry company. And they dare to disrespect me?" She thought of something and decided to publish a post on Facebook. #IreneaBaby, I didn't think it would come to this either. JPG, hashtag inside the picture, there was a dog sitting on the upper floor and looking down at the people below. Many netizens immediately noticed the connotation of this picture, and her fans hastily commented when they saw their idol had published a post to tell them that someone had bullied her. Hashtag Irenababy is mine, what's wrong, at Irenababy? I thought you were at the shooting site for the company that you become the spokesperson of? Hashtag Irenababy at Renababy is mine sigh, maybe they think I'm not good enough. Hashtag Irene supporter at Renababy what? Don't tell me that they have changed the spokesperson. Hashtag Irene gave her fans a crying emoticon as a reply, and her fans were infuriated at what happened to their idol. A few days ago, she had just published a post about her becoming the spokesperson of Soul Jewelry. And her fans were not happy with Soul Jewelry changing the spokesperson all of a sudden. All of them swarmed into Soul Jewelry's Facebook and fought on behalf of their idol. In the afternoon, the post hashtag Soul called off the contract with Irene hashtag appeared on Google Trends. After Lewis had finished the shooting, Maisie went to check the photos. Although he just showed his face for 1 minute, and most of them were the close-ups of his back and profile, the shooting crew was still amazed. The theme for Soul's jewelry was dark. The combination of black and blue gave off a regally elegant yet subtly sophisticated vibe. A single close-up shot of him wearing the dark-themed ring of Soul Jewelry was akin to a masterpiece that was crafted to perfection. Indeed. It was a hand that played the violin that took nearly $1 million to maintain. He merely showed his hand, and the female staff members were already fawning over him. After Lewis came out of the fitting room in his usual outfit, Maisie walked up to him. Thank you for your help, Mr. Lucas. I'll transfer the payment to you later. That's not necessary, Lewis replied as he buttoned up the button on his sleeve. He lowered his head and continued. After all, you're my cousin, but I'll only be helping you this time. Don't call me and ask me to do something like this ever again. Maisie smiled. Sure, I'll keep that in mind. By the way, why didn't you ask for help from Mr. Goldman? Lewis asked. I'm sure he'd be more than willing to help you. Maisie was stumped. Then she shrugged and said, he's a businessman, and I don't think he's fit to be the spokesperson of a jewelry company. So are you saying that I'm fit to be the spokesperson of a jewelry company? He frowned. Maisie measured him up and down, lifted her brows, and laughed. You're tall. After all. Lewis was rendered speechless. After Maisie returned to the office, Kennedy informed her about Google Trends. He handed a tablet to her and said, Irene knows that we've changed the spokesperson. Maisie tapped on the tablet and asked, Does Irene have other plans for today? Kennedy shook his head. She told us that she's available today, and that's why we scheduled the shooting for today. However, her assistant said that she's having a recording for a variety show. And we aren't sure if she really has taken on another variety show or not. Well, be that as it may, she's the one who broke her promise. Let her vent spleen first. We'll see what we'll do when the endorsement is released. Chapter 454. Maisie put the tablet down. She was going to make use of the result of Lewis being their spokesperson to prove Irene and the public that they were wrong. By the time Maisie got home, she saw that Stephen was preparing dinner for the kids while Waylon, the little adult, was helping him in the kitchen. Daisy and Colton were playing games on the couch. When they saw her, Daisy put the gamepad down and greeted, Mommy, welcome home. Have you finished with work? Yeah, I've finished with work, Maisie replied as she took off her shoe. Reddy was lying next to them. Perhaps it was exhausted from playing with the kids as it soon closed its eyes and went back to sleep after taking a look at Maisie. While Stephen was setting up the table, he said to the kids, Dinner is ready. Go wash your hands and come eat. Alrighty. Colton and Daisy put the gamepads down, got up to their feet, and went to wash their hands. Reddy made a stretch and hopped down from the couch. It immediately walked over when it saw that Waylon was pouring its food into the feeder. Waylon stroked its fur and asked, when will Reddy get bigger? Stephen laughed. It's only a few months old. It's still early. Well, then, eat more and grow up faster into a chubby dog, Waylon said to Reddy. Daisy ran up to the table, and Stephen carried her to her chair. She raised her head to look at Stephen and asked, Grandpa, can we take Reddy back with us for a few days? Since they liked Reddy very much, Stephen stroked her head and said, sure. Yippee! Sherry exclaimed happily. We can play with Reddy again. You guys don't have time to play with Reddy. Colton needs to attend school, and you two need to go to Royal Crown Entertainment Company. Reddy will be very bored if you bring it home with you guys, Maisie chimed in helplessly. Daisy pouted and said, You're right. She thought for a moment and added, We'll come to visit Grandpa every day then. Maisie pinched her nose and said, Do you think I don't know that you just want to come and play with Reddy? Daisy wrinkled her nose and snorted with her head held high. I don't care. Stephen chuckled as he handed a plate of spaghetti to Daisy. You can come to play with Reddy whenever you want. Come, have some. You too, Colton and Waylon. Thank you, Grandpa. Colton and Waylon thanked Stephen at the same time. Stephen put the fork down and stood up on his feet when he heard the bell. I'll go answer the door. When he opened the door and saw Nolan, he was stunned. Mr. Goldman, you, good evening, sir. Nolan bowed his head slightly and greeted respectfully, which made Stephen a little uncomfortable. Daddy, how did you get here? Colton raised his head, his eyes glowing brightly. Daisy rolled her eyes at her brother and said, Of course, Daddy is here for Mommy. Do you even need to ask? Stephen gave Nolan another set of cutlery and plates. He knew their situation, but he figured that he shouldn't ask so many questions in front of the kids. After all, the kids still did not know that their parents were getting a divorce. Hee, did you feel lonely eating alone at home, so you came to look for Mommy? Maisie was stunned. She lifted her head to look at Colton and frowned. You shouldn't talk when you're eating, she said. Nolan pressed his lips tightly and did not say anything. Waylon noticed something and asked, Daddy, are you having a fight with Mommy? After hearing what Waylon said, Daisy and Colton looked toward Nolan and Maisie. Did their parents really have a fight? Sensing the awkward situation between the two, Stephen chimed in and said, Silly kid, there's no way your parents are fighting. If they were fighting, would your daddy still come here? Chapter 455. The kids felt Stephen was right. Besides, if their parents were really having a fight, then Nolan wouldn't have come here to have dinner with them. The kids decided to stay for a night after they finished their dinner. Stephen brought the kids back to their rooms to tell them bedtime stories. At the same time, he wanted to leave some personal space for Maisie and Nolan. Maisie was cleaning the table and doing the dishes in the kitchen while Nolan watched on. He clenched his fists multiple times. And then he walked into the kitchen. He rolled his sleeves up and said, Let me help you. Maisie was stunned. Before she could make any response, Nolan had taken the plate in her hand away. Maisie remained standing, frozen stiff on the spot. She said with her head lowered, Are you doing this for the kids? His eyelashes fluttered slightly, and he replied, Yeah. Maisie broke into laughter. How long do you think we can keep this up? Nolan froze, but he did not say anything. Biting her lower lip, Maisie turned around and said, If you want to stay here, I'll give the room to you, and I'll explain to the kids. Nolan clutched at the plate in his hand tightly. After she left, the only sound left in the large kitchen was the sloshing of the running water. When Maisie came out of the bathroom, she saw Nolan sitting on the bed with a gloomy face. Just when she was about to leave the room, Nolan stopped her by grabbing at her wrist. Dumbfounded, Maisie turned her head to look at him. We're still husband and wife before we get divorced, Nolan said. After that, he let go of her, rose to his feet, and walked past her. I'm going to take a bath. Maisie's face sank. We're still husband and wife before we get divorced? It seemed to her that he was determined to get a divorce from her. Judging from this, she did not have the confidence that she could change his mind. At night, Maisie slept with her back facing Nolan. They were sleeping on the same bed, but it felt as if there was a big gap between them, and none of them dared to cross the line. Maisie couldn't sleep. When she heard the movements behind her, she opened her eyes. In the next second, the man behind her grabbed her into his arms, causing her to freeze. She then turned her head around in surprise. Nolan? Nolan did not make any progress after that. He just looked at her for a long while and held her tightly in his arms. Let's sleep. Maisie did not say anything. Her long eyelashes fell and covered the disappointment in her eyes. Did he still love her? Maisie couldn't tell. By the time Maisie woke up the following day, Nolan was already gone. After cleaning herself up, she came downstairs. The 3 kids were eating breakfast prepared by Stephen. But Nolan was nowhere to be seen. Morning, Mommy, Daisy greeted as she sipped from her glass of milk, leaving some milk around her mouth in the process. Maisie chuckled and took a paper towel to wipe her mouth. Then, she said, Morning, Daisy. Maisie sat in front of the table and asked, Where is Nolan? Daddy has gone to his office. He asked us not to disturb you and let you sleep a little more, Colton replied. Maisie smiled but did not say anything. After they finished their breakfast, Stephen walked Maisie to the door. Z. I know I have no right to poke my nose into the affairs between you and Mr. Goldman, but if you really come to a point where you need to make a decision, I just want you to know that I'll support you no matter what. Maisie turned her head around to look at him and forced a smile on her face. She nodded and replied, Thank you, Dad. She drove her car and came to Soul Jewelry. There was a group of people holding signs in front of the company. All of them were Irene's fans, and they were here to stand up for Irene. Had it not been for the security to keep them under control, there was a probability that they would have rushed into the company and caused trouble. As soon as Maisie got out of her car, someone shouted, Ms. Zora. Chapter 456. Several reporters suddenly appeared in front of Maisie to interview her. Ms. Zora, may I ask if the replacement of Soul Jewelry's spokesperson is happening because Irene Linwood isn't famous enough? Can you explain what's the reason behind Soul Jewelry's unilateral breach of contract and its decision to collaborate with another spokesperson? The camera was almost shoved into Maisie's face while the fans on the side shouted. Soul Jewelry is just another snobby brand that looks down on others. Get your sorry *SS out of Bassburg. A trash brand like Soul isn't worthy of our Irene. Maisie's eyes dimmed as she looked at the camera. She then sneered. Did you not hear what her fans just said? A brand like us is indeed not worthy of an artist like Irene. The reporters were rendered speechless. They thought she would have an explanation for this situation and did not expect her attitude to be so rigid. She isn't afraid of being torn apart by Irene's fans. Is she? Irene's fans got extremely piqued when they heard her response, and someone from the crowd rushed up and stretched out his hands to push Maisie. Suddenly, a strong arm grabbed Maisie into his arms and pushed the fan who assaulted her away. Maisie turned her head, took a glimpse at the familiar facial outline, and was slightly startled. Nolan glanced at the fan, who fell to the ground, then shifted his gaze toward those people at the side. His tone sounded stern and cold. If you don't want your idol to be banned from the entertainment industry, get out of here. The fans making a fuss were obviously frightened by Nolan's imposing manner, but some fans still managed to muster some courage and shouted, What right do you have to ban her from showbiz? That's not how things should work even if you have the power to do so. Nolan's eyes looked gloomy and cold, and his hostility became slightly more prominent. Come again? The fans who had just refuted him were too afraid even to open their mouth immediately. Maisie pulled Nolan away and walked up to the fans. Before you start creating another stir out here again, please go and find it out yourselves. Irene signed a contract and agreed to be Soul's spokesperson, but was a no-show on the same day the contract was signed. So, is it because Soul Jewelry isn't worthy of hiring someone else? Or is Irene too popular now that she's turning up her nose at others? I can understand your idol's decision to want to be a poser, but I won't let her do so with Soul Jewelry. I'll make myself clear here today, once and for all. Soul Jewelry will never hire untrustworthy artists like Irene ever again in the future. Maisie finished expressing her thoughts, left a flustered crowd behind, turned around, and walked back into the company. She entered the elevator, saw that Nolan was still following her, and turned around suspiciously. Nolan Goldman, aren't you supposed to be heading to the company? Nolan's thin lips were slightly pursed. He had come here just to see her, but he did not admit it. I was just passing by, Maisie smirked. You were just passing by? Then why aren't you heading back now? Nolan's clenched hands loosened. Yeah, call me if something else pops up. He left after saying that. Maisie stared at his silhouette as he departed from the scene, and the corners of her lips rose slightly. Sure enough. He was still worried about me. She walked back to her office and saw Sherry talking to Kennedy again. After Sherry saw her, she hurriedly stepped forward and asked, Maisie, you've come back. The fans downstairs didn't make things difficult for you, right? Why are you back here again? Maisie smiled. She had asked Sherry to go back to the training camp. After all, she did not need Sherry to follow her around anymore. Sherry did not dare to say that Nolan had asked her to follow Maisie around, so she scratched her cheeks. Oh. I missed you, Maisie. It's too boring in the training camp, and I'm looking for something to do. I'm one of Soul's employees from now on, and I don't need you to pay me. Maisie gazed at her suspiciously. Chapter 457. Sherry, a young lady who loves money as much as her life, would actually say that she doesn't want a salary? Kennedy came over. Mr. Lucas' endorsement video has been released. Maisie nodded as her gaze turned sharp. Alright, let's wait for Irene to embarrass herself now. Hashtag Soul spokesperson, Louis Lucas hashtag Irene Linwood was a no-show and was reprimanded for being a poser. Hashtag Soul Jewelry instantly caused a sensation among netizens after its official account released Louis's endorsement video on YouTube and other social media platforms. Many netizens thought that if Soul could invite Louis Lucas, the Prince of Violin, and had the balls to replace Irene, it was obvious that Irene had really outposed herself and had managed to provoke Soul Jewelry. Just as the netizens expressed their different opinions and defended their respective views, Irene's fans were still whitewashing Irene. They even released a video in which Maisie mentioned that Irene was unworthy to make things worse. However, what Irene's fans did online backfired very soon. Soul Jewelry's official accounts released the contract signed by Irene together with the schedule that they had on that day. There was also a statement that explained how things happened on the day of the filming of the endorsement video, which claimed that Irene had missed the appointment without providing any reason beforehand, causing Soul's staff members to wait for her throughout the whole afternoon. Irene's assistant had told Soul's person in charge that Irene was recording a variety show on that day. But Irene had already agreed on the shooting schedule before that and had breached the contract just because of the schedule conflict. After that, some of the netizens who could not stand Irene's attitude actually found a video recording online that showed Irene had been enjoying her afternoon at a private swimming pool of a hotel on the day of the shooting, ignoring the terms that she had agreed on listed in the endorsement contract. After all the documents and videos were posted online, Irene was being smoked by the netizens from all sides. This series of events also established and reaffirmed her image as a poser and the fact that she had been replaced because of her arrogance. When Irene saw the news about her all over the social media platforms, she trembled with anger and smashed her phone on the table. How did this happen? Her assistant picked up the phone, looked at the post displayed on the screen, and the expression on her face changed instantly. But Irene had already grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her like a madman before she could say anything. Clarify for me now. Irene. Calm down first. How do you expect me to calm down? I have to ask my uncle for help. Irene grabbed her phone and called her uncle. All these posts will definitely be removed from the trending searches as soon as my uncle comes forward. She got on the phone. Uncle, please help me. I have a problem now. I didn't bring you into the entertainment industry just so that you can become a show-off. You really have the guts to provoke just about anyone out there, huh? So do you know who the owner of Soul Jewelry is? It's Mrs. Goldman. And you still want me to help you out? Irene was completely stunned after her uncle reprimanded her. The owner behind Soul Jewelry is actually Mrs. Goldman? But isn't that just a newly established jewelry company? Uncle, please help me too. I can't help you when it comes to this matter. You're on your own now. Her uncle then hung up the call. Irene sat slumped on the couch. And her manager called at this moment. She answered the call in a daze. Mr. Yankoff. Irene Linwood, look at this pile of shit you've just brought to the agency. You've just risen to fame after a few years in showbiz, and you're already starting to be so full of yourself? Now, not only Soul, but even Taylor and other jewelry companies have issued notices to prohibit you from endorsing any of their jewelry. The jewelry industry has officially banned you, and all your career opportunities have been completely cut off. You're not going to get any endorsement opportunities in the future. Irene finally understood how it was all her fault, but it was already too late. No one dared to say anything about her when she acted arrogantly and presumptuously. Others would only turn a blind eye in the past when her uncle was there to protect her, but she had run into someone who was out of her league now. At Black Gold. Nolan read the news and posts spreading across all social media platforms as a faint hint of amusement flashed across his eyes. Seems that she solved it. Chapter 458. Nolan placed the tablet down, opened the drawer, and looked at the divorce papers. There was a knock on the door. Nolan closed the drawer as Quincy walked in. Sir, me Hernandez de Arma wishes to meet you. Nolan paused, lowered his gaze, and said nonchalantly, let him in. Quincy went out to report for a short moment before Hernandez entered the office and sat on the couch by himself. Nolan got up and walked to the couch while Quincy poured some tea and then exited the room and closed the door. Mr. de Arma. Is there anything that requires my attention? Hernandez raised his head, took a glance at him, and said with a lukewarm tone, yes. Hernandez continued coldly after Nolan sat down. I know what happened to you and Maisie in Staslo. And I can understand what Maisie told me the other day now. Nolan frowned. What did Z tell you? Hernandez looked calmly and straight at him, his expression one of disapproval. You should be thankful that my granddaughter has a thing for you. I once asked her to leave you. And I also reminded her that if she were to insist that she wants to stay with you, she would run into some life-threatening incidents sooner or later because of your identity. Even if I don't use her to deal with the Goldmans. Those people won't necessarily do the same. Nolan's lips were tightly pursed, forming a line. What did she tell me back then? She told me that she would never turn against you even when the whole world was to do so. And she would never leave you. Hernandez's words sent a hint of shock through the bottom of Nolan's eyes, and his hands, which were placed on his thighs, clenched tightly and trembled a little. Z. Did she actually say that? Hernandez glanced at him. My granddaughter asked me about your mother's kidnapping incident from 15 years ago, the day she came to see me. I know the Goldmans have always thought that I'm the one who did it back then, and I never thought to clarify anything to you. My hatred for the Goldmans originates from the death of my father and my amputated leg, as both these incidents are related to your great-grandfather, but what Maisie said that day made me feel a little concerned. Hernandez pondered for a moment and added, maybe the hatred between the Goldmans and me was, as she said, misguided. Nolan lowered his gaze and said indifferently, when someone lured me to Staslo with the cause of my mother's death. I already guessed that the cause of my mother's death wasn't that simple. Hernandez put his hands together, intertwined his fingers, and then placed them on his thigh. I know that those people were behind your mother's incident from 15 years ago. But because of my hatred for the Goldmans, I thought it didn't matter, even if I was not the one who did it. One more or one less crime on my shoulders wouldn't extinguish the hatred rooted deep in my heart. His gaze looked cold and stern after he finished speaking. Actually, I know that those people have always wanted to win the de Armas over. I came to Zlokova in search of my granddaughter and learned about her relationship with you, but I didn't plan to disclose her relationship with the de Armas, just to play on the safer side. Because I don't want her to go through what my daughter, Marina, had to go through. Nolan was astonished. What do you mean by that? Hernandez's expression turned extremely regretful and depressed, while his gaze, which had always been sharp and keen, appeared to look sorrowful and agonizing. Do you know how heartbroken I was when Maisie told me that her mother died of the sleeper virus? Her infection, it's because of me. A hint of surprise flashed across Nolan's eyes. Z's mother died of the virus too? My daughter Marina was only 17 years old 30 years ago. She wanted to sign herself up as a volunteer in the area where the virus outbreak took place. I was very worried about her, afraid that the threat of the virus would still be lingering in the area. Chapter 459. Back then, the Kents were still my allies. They gave me a vial and told me that it was a vaccine that could resist the virus infection. So because I trusted in the Kents and how much I worried about my daughter's well-being, I bought it with a lot of money. I then injected the vaccine into my daughter. Hernandez clenched his fists and gnashed his teeth. I didn't expect my daughter to be still infected by the virus. It's no wonder she would suddenly leave the de Armas a year later and travel to Morwich with Strix. Those people actually lied to me for decades. As for that vial, it was not the vaccine at all, but a prototype of the virus. And they lied to me so that I would use my daughter for the experiment. The atmosphere in the office remained silent for a moment while Nolan poured himself a cup of tea and then asked slowly, "Is the virus part of their experiment? Erwin told me in Staslo that my infection is only the first step." Hernandez's emotional breakdown was caused upon learning the truth behind his daughter's infection even after being vaccinated. Thus, he did not plan to hide it anymore. Regarding the incident that involved the eldest princess, the reason my father chose to withdraw the de Armas from the disputes within the royal family was actually not all because of the incident where Patrick Goldman held me hostage. Patrick Goldman held me hostage to force my father into taking a step backward. I then lost a leg and found out that my father's death was related to Patrick Goldman. All these had caused me to hate Patrick Goldman and the Goldmans. I admit that I was blinded by hatred. So I listened to them. My father had always been aware of what experiments those leftists were running, but he had always thought those experiments were carried out to invent vaccines to cure the virus. My father used to lock himself in his room for a whole week after the outbreak 30 years ago. He was extremely depressed the last time I saw him. And the last thing that he said to me was not to follow in his footsteps. I didn't understand what he meant at that time. But then I never heard from him until the day I was informed of the cause of his death. I was very angry. Hernandez took a deep breath. He had reflected on it for a few days and thought carefully about what his father had said back then and how the vaccine these people had given to him turned out to be the virus itself. He finally understood everything. Patrick Goldman did almost die at my father's hands back then. But come to think about it, given his skills, my father shouldn't even be able to hurt him at all. However, my father managed to injure him severely as if it was a piece of cake. It's obvious that he was no longer in his prime at that time, after my father died. They told me that Patrick Goldman was the one who killed him. I was young and impulsive back then, so all I wanted was to seek revenge on Patrick Goldman, but he didn't get to live long later on. Nolan's eyes turned gloomy. I've had the chance to experience my great-grandfather's skills through my grandfather, because my great-grandfather was the one who taught him all those skills. My grandfather got infected too. He understood one thing immediately and asked, "What kind of experiment is that?" Hernandez closed his eyes for a while before answering his question with a distressed expression. "You should know what all the wealthy people in the world are afraid of, right?" Nolan pursed his lips tightly. He then added, "They're afraid of the sufferings that they'll get from aging, illnesses, and death, which, according to the law of nature, are inevitable stages of life. No medicine in this world could bless any human with immortality. Yet, they were willing to try it as long as it could relieve the suffering they would get from illnesses, or even prevent cancer. The same applies to the royals, so they want to invent an antibody. That's how they started to illegally develop a virus that could change one's genetic constitution. They then injected the virus into humans and injected the vaccine into them later on, but all the trials failed, which led to the major outbreak from 30 years ago. That was how the panic caused by the epidemic led to the failure of the princess, causing her to lose the people's trust and support. Hence, she fell into their trap later on." Chapter 460. Nolan clasped his hands that were placed in front of him tightly before opening his pursed lips slightly. "They're still experimenting." Hernandez was stunned and then asked, "How did you know about that?" "Because I've been infected." His indifferent gaze landed on the teacup. "There's no incubation period this time around. It's a new virus." "Does Maisie know about this?" "She doesn't know." Hernandez was shocked and did not speak for a long time. Nolan stared at him. "Z's mother was infected with the virus. She must have taken something to counter it after that, which is why Z isn't showing any signs of infection. Not to mention that her blood is very special." Hernandez took a deep breath and picked up the teacup but did not drink from it. Nolan then said nonchalantly, "Illinois divorce." Maisie Hernandez glanced at Nolan for quite a while. Judging from what he just saw, he could see that Nolan really cared about his granddaughter. He then put down the teacup. "I see, please keep it a secret for me." "Don't you plan to live on?" Hernandez asked him calmly. There was a very subtle surge of emotion at the bottom of Nolan's dimmed eyes, and he did not answer the question directly. "You and Erwin will be here protecting her, and I've also given her half of Black Gold shares. The Goldmans won't fall even if I die now. This is also on the escape hatch." After Hernandez left, Nolan started coughing violently all of a sudden, and the blood spilling from his mouth stained his fingers red. Quincy opened the door when he heard the sound and stepped forward to support him with a panicked expression. "Sir, I'll take you to the hospital. You can't go to the hospital alone." Nolan's face gradually turned pale. "I'll leave the divorce procedures to you, but fetch me back first." Maisie had been sitting in her office all afternoon. Her eyelids kept twitching, which made her feel a little worried. There was an uneasy feeling lurking in a dark corner of her heart. At this time, she received a message from Quincy, and her expression became extremely sorrowful when she saw that it was about Nolan assigning her to take care of the divorce procedures. Maisie put on plain makeup and planned to head to Nolan's office to talk about the terms of the divorce. Surprisingly, she was told that Nolan had not come to his office for a few days already, and Quincy had been in charge of the company's affairs. She walked toward the administrative office, and Quincy was really the only person in the office. "Ms. Vanderbilt, you've come." Quincy got up and placed the agreement on the desk. "Mr. Goldman asked you to sign it first." "Nolan's really planning to get a divorce?" Maisie was so calm that it felt a little scary. Quincy lowered his gaze as his facial expression looked very tense. "I'm sorry, Ms. Vanderbilt. Mr. Goldman has his reasons when it comes to this matter." "I want to see Nolan." Quincy replied. "Mr. Goldman said that he won't be seeing anyone for the meantime." "Quincy, why don't you tell me what happened to Nolan?" Once Maisie could not get an answer from Nolan, she could only turn to Quincy and ask him. Quincy knows that Maisie was worried about Nolan, but he could not tell her anything. "I'm very sorry, Ms. Vanderbilt. Maisie understood from his facial expression and then glanced at the divorce agreement. I won't sign it then. Quincy was taken aback. Unfortunately, Maisie left, but he couldn't say anything. Maisie walked to the building trance and got into her car, and her hands holding the steering wheel tightened wide. Her heart ached. Divorce, divorce, divorce. Nolan Goldman. Is this what you promised me in the beginning? You only planned to shove me away without telling me anything? Keep dreaming. Maisie picked up her phone and called Riley. Riley, are you free tonight? Let's meet over a drink.